Today I am sharing how to make sourdough bread from my favorite ancient grain. So what exactly is an ancient grain? Ancient grains are those grains that have not been changed by selective breeding and hybridization. Modern wheat is a hybrid of the ancient type of wheat called Einkorn. So it is very different from its original form that grew in the wild, while Einkorn is still the same grain as it was thousands of years ago. I begin my bread making process by grinding fresh einkorn berries. I like to use a Nutri-Mill, and I grind my grains fresh because it will improve the flavor and increase the nutrients, because it will not be sitting on a shelf becoming rancid and losing nutrients over time. The fresher, the better. It's very easy to use. You just turn the knob at the top, which will adjust the fineness of the actual flour. If you are not ready to invest in an electric grain mill, you could start like we did by getting a hand crank mill, which is very cheap and a fun way to try freshly ground flour. This method is much more time consuming. Once you have your flour, it is time to refresh a sourdough starter. I keep my starter in the fridge and take it out when I'm ready to make bread. So I take a small amount of the starter from the fridge, I add the freshly ground flour, and then I add a little bit of filtered reverse osmosis water until it is a little bit thicker than pancake batter. I find that when it's a little bit thicker, it bubbles up better. I have noticed a big difference in freshly ground flour in sourdough starter and how quickly it reacts. It's nice and bubbly, and it seems to love those fresh grains. For bread baking, it is very helpful to use a scale, and I make all my bread in glass. I have read that using a metal bowl may react with the sourdough because of the acidity of the sourdough itself and affect the bread. So we are using a glass bowl, and I'm adding 1.5 cups of refreshed sourdough starter and making sure that this is 100% Einkorn sourdough starter. If you have a sourdough starter at home, you could convert this to a Einkorn sourdough starter by just adding a bit more Einkorn at a time until it is 100%. Next, we add 300 grams of water and stir. Then we are adding 600 grams of fresh Einkorn flour. Finally, we add 2 teaspoons of microplastic-free salt. We are going to combine everything until a thick dough forms. Einkorn flour takes a little longer than modern wheat flour to absorb all of the moisture, so we need to make sure to let this sit for 30 minutes before our next step. So we cover with a plate and let that rest for 30 minutes. Next, we are going to uncover the dough and wet the hand that will be working with the dough. This is going to help with the stickiness of Einkorn. It can be difficult to work with, but I find that wetting my hand really helps. We are going to pull the dough from the edges into the center, kind of like a stretch and fold. At this point, the gluten has not strengthened yet, so we need to do this process a few more times with some rests in between to strengthen that gluten so that we can have a crumb in the bread. The crumb in the bread is not going to be as big as in a modern wheat dough, but it is going to still be very delicious. So I am continuing to stretch and fold until the dough forms into a ball and will stay in its form. Once we are finished with this first stretch and fold, we are going to cover it with a plate, and then we're going to let that sit for 30 minutes again. This will be the first step of fermenting the dough and turning it into a sourdough bread. After that's been sitting 30 minutes, stretch and fold the dough again. As you can see, the gluten is strengthening and we're able to pull the edges up a little bit higher this time. Each time we are repeating this process, the gluten is strengthening so that we can get a loaf instead of just a flat mound. We're going to cover again and repeat that process 2 more times. Then we're going to let it rest for about 5 hours until the dough is nicely risen and fermented. If you are interested in looking into the NutriMill or the hand cranked mill, I will link them in the description box below. Now it's time for our final rise of the dough. So we take out some parchment paper and we're going to again wet the hand we're working with the dough with. And as you can see, the dough has spread out and it's no longer a ball, so we need to do our stretch and fold and form into a ball again. This is because it has risen and become very bubbly. Now we can form it into a ball and place it on our parchment paper, then simply cover with a bowl so it doesn't get dried out and let that sit for about an hour. Then we're going to preheat the oven to 450 degrees with our Dutch oven in the oven. And we are ready to score the dough and place it in our Dutch oven. With this method, we are not getting as pretty as a loaf because we are using the parchment paper, no extra flour, and the dough is not going to cut as evenly as if we were to cool it down. So there is an alternative method where we can get a prettier dough that it does require some extra flour, which if you don't tolerate flour very well that is not fermented, I wouldn't recommend this method. But we will put some flour in the bottom of a bowl and put it seam side up and then let it refrigerate slowly overnight to do a final proof. Then we can put it directly into the preheated cast iron and we can go ahead and score the dough, and it's going to come out a lot prettier because of that even cut. And the dough is also easier to handle because it's cooled down. This is a longer process. It's not as fast as just leaving it on the counter, but it will make a prettier loaf with a bit more of rise because of the slow rise in the refrigerator. For both recipes though, you are going to place your dough into the cast iron Dutch oven. You're going to cover and then bake at 450 for 40 minutes. I did not eat bread for years because I did not tolerate gluten well, that I find that einkorn I'm able to tolerate if I make it sourdough. But again, only eat a small amount at a time because grains can be irritating if we eat too much. If you want to learn more about einkorn and see the full recipe, I will link my blog post in the description box below. Thanks for watching. If you have tried einkorn wheat, I would love to hear about your experience in the comments below.